A storm swept across the Cotswolds the night Prudence Whitcomb found an abandoned baby on her doorstep, wrapped in rags, crying against the wind, and carrying a secret that would change her life forever. In a world where compassion was a sin and reputation a weapon, one act of mercy would defy the boundaries of class, honor, and fate itself. And when the child's true father, a haunted English marquess, arrives years later to claim him, love and duty will collide in a battle that could cost them everything. Stay with us for this unforgettable journey of forbidden love and redemption. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Help us reach 1,000 hearts so we can keep bringing you more timeless stories of passion and destiny. The Cotswolds, England, 1814. The morning broke pale and shivering over the honey-coloured cottages of the village, the kind of dawn that trembles between frost and light. Mist hung low upon the meadows, and the bell of St. Bridget's Church had not yet sounded when Prudence Whitcomb stepped out into the silence. Her cloak was drawn tight around her shoulders, her breath rising in small clouds as she crossed the narrow lane toward the churchyard. The stillness was absolute, until she heard it. A cry, thin, sharp, desperate. She froze. The sound came again, softer this time, muffled by cloth and cold. Her heart jolted as she followed the echo along the stone wall at the back of the churchyard, the place where ivy grew thick and shadows lingered even in daylight. Kneeling, she brushed aside a damp corner of linen, and there he was, a newborn, barely alive. He was swaddled in worn grey fabric, his tiny fists trembling against the cold air, his breath shallow. His skin, dark and luminous against the pale wrappings, glistened with frost. Prudence's hands, trained to remain steady, trembled for the first time in years. "Dear heaven," she whispered, her voice breaking, "who could leave you here?" She gathered the child close to her chest, her body instantly warming his fragile form. The infant whimpered, a sound of pain and confusion that sliced through her. Without hesitation, she pulled open her cloak, pressing him against her dress to share her warmth. The beat of his heart was faint, but there, that tiny rhythm bound her to him before she even realized what she had done. By the time she reached her cottage at the edge of the green, the sun had begun to rise, thin, golden, and cold. Prudence placed the baby beside the fire, fed him drops of warm milk, and waited until the shivers in his limbs softened into sleep. She watched him for a long while, her hands folded in her lap, her mind racing through fear, compassion, and something deeper, a feeling that had no name, only certainty. When he stirred, his eyes opened for the first time. They were dark, deep, unguarded, and filled with the pure innocence of survival. Prudence caught her breath. "You've been sent to me, haven't you?" she murmured softly. "You're not a burden. You're a blessing, though they won't see it that way." Later that morning, the village saw. By the time she crossed the square with the baby wrapped tightly in clean cloth, a few neighbors had already begun whispering. Mrs. Keene from the bakery stopped kneading her dough to stare. Two farmhands paused their work to exchange uneasy glances. Prudence's calm smile did not reach her eyes. She knew the rhythm of gossip as well as the rhythm of the heart. Once it began, it did not stop easily. At the vicarage, Reverend Pembroke met her at the door, his face lined with concern and indecision. "You found him near the church?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she replied, lifting her chin. "He was left to die in the cold." The Reverend sighed, glancing toward the small bundle in her arms. "You understand, Miss Whitcomb, that this will bring questions. You cannot simply keep him. The parish has rules." "The parish did not save his life," she said firmly. "I did." "Boo, Prudence," he began gently. "The villagers will talk. They already do." Her voice held no bitterness, only the weary grace of a woman who had long stopped expecting approval from others. She turned toward the fire, watching the embers flicker against the Reverend's study walls. If they choose to gossip, let them gossip about mercy. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the fields, Prudence sat by her hearth with the baby asleep in her arms. The flames painted her face in soft gold, and the little cottage, humble and tidy, seemed warmer than it had ever been. She traced one fingertip along the child's tiny hand and whispered, "You'll need a name, little one. Something that holds strength." After a long silence, she smiled faintly. "Jonah? Yes, you'll be Jonah." The name seemed to fill the room. As if spoken aloud, it became a promise. She rocked him gently, humming a lullaby her mother once sang, the melody old as the stones of the village. Outside, the winter wind moaned through the hedgerows, carrying with it the murmurs of a world quick to judge what it does not understand. Yet inside that modest cottage there was a peace untouched by cruelty. Prudence watched Jonah's sleeping face, and for the first time in many years, her heart felt complete. What she did not see, what no one yet knew, was the dark carriage that had stopped at the crest of the hill that same morning before the village had fully woken. A man within had looked down upon the valley with weary eyes, the seal of Ashcroft glinting faintly on the side of the coach. He had hesitated there for several minutes before ordering his driver to continue onward toward the distant estate. Prudence, unaware of how fate was already circling closer, drew the blanket tighter around Jonah and whispered, "You are safe now, my darling. No one will ever hurt you again." The words, simple and unguarded, bound her to a destiny she could not yet imagine, a destiny that would test her compassion, her courage, and her heart. The weeks that followed the morning Prudence Whitcomb found the baby by the churchyard felt at once like a season of light and a slow gathering of storm. Winter began to loosen its grip, but the hearts of her neighbors seemed to harden with every passing day. At first, there were polite silences, the kind that fill a room like mist, unspoken questions, cautious smiles that never reached the eyes. Then came the whispers, carried on the wind like frost over the fields. By the end of the first month, Prudence could feel the shift in the air. It was in the way the butcher's wife turned away when she entered the square, in the way two girls lowered their voices as she passed with Jonah wrapped snugly against her chest. Even the laughter of children paused when she walked by. It was not open cruelty. The Cotswolds had too much pride for that. It was the quieter, colder judgment that hurts more for being disguised as civility. Each morning, Prudence rose before the sun to light her small hearth and prepare Jonah's milk. The baby had grown stronger. His cheeks were round now, his eyes bright and searching. He had learned the sound of her voice, turning toward it as though it were music. When he smiled for the first time, Prudence nearly wept. "You see, my love," she whispered, pressing her lips to his forehead, "life is still kind when it wants to be." The village, however, no longer felt kind. Work came less frequently. The families who once depended on her skill for births or fevers began to send for a younger woman from a neighboring hamlet. Prudence told herself it did not matter, that she would manage with less, but she could not deny the chill that crept into her heart each time a familiar face looked away. One grey afternoon, as she returned from tending an elderly widow on the outskirts, she saw the vicar waiting at her gate. Reverend Pembroke, with his mild eyes and careful manners, was not a cruel man, but the tremor in his expression told her that what he had come to say would not be gentle. "Good afternoon, Miss Whitcomb," he greeted, his hat pressed nervously between his hands. "Good afternoon, Reverend," she replied, adjusting Jonah's blanket and unlocking her gate. "Is someone ill?" "No, not ill." He hesitated, glancing toward the small cottage behind her, then back to her face. "May I come in?" Prudence nodded and led him inside. The little parlour smelled faintly of lavender and milk. A fire glowed in the hearth, and Jonah's cradle stood near it, lined with soft cloth she had sewn herself. The Reverend lingered by the door, his discomfort heavy in the silence. He cleared his throat. "Prudence, you know how deeply I admire your dedication. The village owes you much for your service. But there has been concern." "Concern?" she echoed softly. "About the child." His gaze fell to Jonah, who was sleeping peacefully, his tiny fingers curled around the edge of the blanket. "There are some who believe it improper for you to keep him here. They question where he came from, whether... Well, you know how tongues wag." Prudence's jaw tightened. "And what do you believe, Reverend?" He hesitated. "I believe your intentions are good, but good intentions do not always protect one from misunderstanding. The parish committee met yesterday. They fear gossip could harm not only your reputation, but the peace of the community. So they would rather send an innocent baby to the workhouse," she said, her voice trembling, though not with fear. "They would rather see him perish quietly than see me defy their pride." "Please," he murmured, "keep your voice down. I am only a messenger." Prudence turned toward the fire. The warmth on her face did little to ease the cold growing inside her. "I will not surrender him. He is mine to care for until the Almighty decides otherwise. They can speak as they wish." The Reverend sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "I fear they will do more than speak. A delegation may come to—" "Then let them come," she interrupted, her eyes glinting like steel. "They will find a woman who stands by her conscience." He said nothing more. When he finally left, Prudence stood by the window, watching him disappear down the narrow lane until his black coat became a shadow. Then she returned to the cradle and knelt beside it. Jonah stirred, half waking, his small face soft with dreams. "I promised you safety, my little one," she whispered, smoothing his hair. "And I will keep that promise, even if I must stand alone against them all." That night the wind howled around the cottage, rattling the shutters like a warning. Prudence lay awake beside Jonah's cradle, listening to the storm. Her thoughts drifted to her late parents, their lessons in honesty, the faith they had taught her to hold fast to. She imagined her mother's voice, calm and resolute. "Right is not decided by those who speak the loudest, my dear, but by those who stand firm when silence would be easier." The next morning, she went to the market square with her head held high. The cobblestones were slick from the previous night's rain, and the air smelled of wet earth and fresh bread. She greeted Mrs. Keene at the bakery with a smile. "Good morning," she said warmly. Mrs. Keene gave a quick nod without meeting her eyes. "Morning," she muttered, then turned to the next customer. Prudence continued to the butcher's, the weaver's, the apothecary, each encounter a small act of defiance. She purchased what little she needed, paid in full, and carried herself with quiet grace. But as she turned to leave, she noticed 3 women across the street, whispering behind gloved hands. One of them, the squire's wife, shook her head in visible disgust. "She thinks charity gives her virtue," one hissed, loud enough for Prudence to hear. "It gives her shame." Prudence stopped. Her heart pounded, but she did not let the hurt show. "Better shame born of kindness," she said calmly, meeting their eyes, "than comfort built upon cruelty." The women fell silent, their cheeks flushing. Prudence walked away, her back straight. By evening, the confrontation had already become talk across the village, and before the week ended, a letter arrived, its seal unfamiliar, its paper fine. She turned it over in her hands, frowning. The handwriting was elegant, the ink a deep blue. She broke the seal and unfolded it slowly. "Miss Prudence Whitcomb, I am informed that you are presently the caretaker of a child found near St. Brigid's Church some weeks past. As this matter concerns the welfare and lineage of the infant, I request the courtesy of a private meeting at your earliest convenience. Please expect my arrival within the fortnight. Respectfully, Nathaniel Ashcroft, Marquess of Ashcroft." For a long moment, she could only stare at the words. The name was one she had heard since childhood, spoken in tones of reverence or envy, the name of the noble family whose estate crowned the distant hill. She read the letter twice, then a third time, until the meaning settled over her like ice. Jonah stirred in his cradle, and she lifted him gently into her arms. His small body was warm against her chest, his head resting beneath her chin. "A marquess," she murmured, her voice barely a breath. "What business could a man like that have with us?" The baby cooed softly, as if answering her question with innocence. For days afterward, Prudence tried to still the unease that gripped her. She went about her work with practiced calm, but inside, her thoughts churned. Was this man the child's kin? A representative of the parish? Or worse, a man seeking to remove Jonah under the pretense of authority? She prayed for guidance, though prayer brought no peace. At night she sat by the fire, rocking Jonah and staring into the flames. "I will not let them take you," she whispered again and again. "Whatever comes, I will not let them." A week later she received no further word, yet the village seemed to sense a change. Rumors of a visitor spread quickly. "A carriage from London," some said. "A nobleman coming to inspect the nurse and her foundling," said others. The gossip slithered through every corner of the Cotswolds until even the air seemed heavy with expectation. That afternoon, as she walked back from a distant cottage where she had helped deliver a farmer's newborn, she felt the first true fear take hold. The road wound through tall hedgerows, the scent of rain still clinging to the earth. The wind carried the distant toll of the church bell and, beneath it, the faint rumble of hooves. She turned, half expecting to see another villager's cart, but the sound grew louder, heavier, more deliberate. A dark carriage appeared at the bend in the road, its wheels cutting clean tracks through the damp soil. The horses were black, sleek, powerful, and at their head rode a driver dressed in formal livery. The carriage itself was elegant but restrained, its crest glinting faintly on the door. Prudence stepped aside, clutching Jonah closer. The carriage slowed as it neared her, the curtains drawn but the air charged with awareness. She could not see who sat inside, but she felt it, a presence watching her, studying her. For a breathless instant, the world seemed to hold still. Then the horses moved on, the sound fading into the distance until only the whisper of the wind remained. Prudence's heart pounded in her chest. She did not know whether to fear the carriage's passing or its inevitable return. When she reached her cottage, she sat at the table in silence, the letter lying open before her. The fire had burned low, casting soft amber shadows on the walls. Jonah slept in his cradle, his breathing even and peaceful. She reached out, tracing her finger along the edge of the parchment, feeling the weight of every word. "Nathaniel Ashcroft," she said aloud, testing the name on her tongue. It felt distant, noble, unreachable, like a life that belonged to another world entirely. She looked toward the cradle and whispered, "Who are you, little one, that such a man would come looking for you?" No answer came, only the soft hiss of the fire and the sound of rain beginning once more against the window panes. Prudence rose, wrapped Jonah in a warm shawl and carried him close. She pressed a kiss to his forehead. "Whatever his reasons, he will find a woman ready to defend what she loves," she murmured, her voice steady now. "No title, no power will make me yield." Outside, the rain thickened, and in the distance, somewhere beyond the rolling hills, a carriage turned toward the village road once again. The morning Nathaniel Ashcroft arrived in the village was colder than it had been in weeks, a pale sky veiled by low clouds, the air filled with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. The people of the Cotswolds woke to the murmur of something unusual. A carriage rolling along the narrow lane that led toward the outskirts, toward the small stone cottage of Prudence Whitcomb. Curtains lifted in quiet curiosity, and doors cracked open as the sound of hooves echoed through the stillness. Prudence was at her hearth, stirring a pot of milk for Jonah, when the faint rhythm of wheels reached her ears. It was not the ordinary creak of a farmer's cart or the rattle of a delivery wagon. It was smooth, deliberate, and heavy with purpose. She froze, her hand tightening around the wooden spoon. The moment she had both dreaded and expected had come. She turned toward the cradle. Jonah was awake, cooing softly, his little fists reaching for her voice. "Hush now, my darling," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Whatever happens, you'll be safe. I promise you that." Then came the knock, firm, precise, echoing through the wooden door like the strike of a bell. Prudence's breath caught in her throat. She crossed the room with quiet dignity, smoothing her plain linen gown, and opened the door. A tall man stood before her, the faint chill of travel clinging to his dark coat. His presence filled the threshold, not with arrogance, but with an intensity that drew the air from the room. His hair, dark brown and swept back from his brow, gleamed faintly beneath the overcast light. His eyes, those solemn, commanding eyes, met hers with an expression she could not name. "Miss Prudence Whitcomb." His voice was low, steady, and cultured, carrying the faint cadence of one accustomed to being obeyed. "Yes," she replied softly, holding her ground. "I am Nathaniel Ashcroft, Marquess of Ashcroft." For a heartbeat neither spoke. The name hung between them, like an invisible weight, one that seemed to carry centuries of distance and duty. Then, in a gesture that surprised her, he removed his gloves, not as a man expecting service, but as one acknowledging equality. "I believe you have been caring for a child," he said quietly. "A boy found near St. Bridget's Church." Her heart began to pound. "I have," she said, her voice calm, though her fingers trembled at her side. "He was abandoned there. No one came for him. I have come for him." The words, though simple, pierced through her like a blade of ice. She did not move. "Why now, my lord? Weeks have passed. The village wanted him sent away, yet you appear after all this time with a claim." He studied her face, and something in his expression softened, a flicker of hesitation. "I did not know he had survived," he confessed, his tone darkened by something like remorse. "I was told there was no child." She stepped aside, her eyes never leaving his. "Then you had best see for yourself." Nathaniel entered the cottage. It was humble but warm, the scent of lavender and smoke mingling with the faint sweetness of milk. His gaze swept the room before resting on the cradle near the fire. Jonah lay there, wrapped in a soft wool blanket, his cheeks flushed from sleep. The sight seemed to strike Nathaniel like a blow. He approached slowly, every movement measured, as though he feared breaking something fragile within himself. When he knelt beside the cradle, Prudence saw his composure waver. His eyes glistened briefly in the flicker of the firelight. "Dear God," he whispered, "he lives." Jonah stirred, blinking up at the stranger, and Nathaniel reached out instinctively, his gloved hand hovering just above the child's face, before pulling back, unsure. "You may touch him," Prudence said softly, her tone stripped of fear. "He won't break." Nathaniel's eyes lifted to hers, dark, uncertain, filled with gratitude and guilt all at once. Slowly, he reached forward, his fingers trembling as they brushed Jonah's tiny hand. The baby's fingers curled around his. The Marquis inhaled sharply, a sound closer to pain than relief. "He has her eyes," he murmured under his breath. Prudence frowned. "Whose eyes, my lord?" He hesitated, his jaw tightening. "Someone I should have protected." There was silence between them then, the kind that breathes with meaning. The fire crackled softly, and the world outside seemed to fade, leaving only the three of them, the woman, the man, and the child, who had drawn their fates together. Prudence straightened, her voice steady once more. "You say you were told he was dead. Who told you?" He looked up at her, his face shadowed by something deeper than grief. "That is not a tale I can easily share." "Then you will forgive me if I cannot easily surrender him." Nathaniel rose slowly, his full height imposing, yet his tone quiet. "You misunderstand me, Miss Whitcomb. I do not intend to take him from your arms today. I only wish to understand what has happened." Her defenses faltered for a moment, but she held his gaze. "And if your understanding leads you to reclaim him?" His lips parted, then closed again. For the first time she saw conflict. Not pride, but sorrow. "Then I will face that decision when the time comes. But for now, I am a man standing before the child of someone I failed." Something shifted inside her then, something that surprised her with its tenderness. Beneath his noble bearing and his quiet command, she saw not arrogance, but loneliness, a man carrying the ruins of his past in silence. "Sit, my lord," she said gently. "You look as though the journey has stolen your breath." He hesitated, then accepted. She poured a small measure of tea, the best she had, and set the cup before him. He took it with a nod, the porcelain looking delicate in his gloved hand. "Miss Whitcomb," he said after a moment, "the village speaks of you. They say you defied them to keep the boy." "I defied cruelty," she replied simply. A faint smile touched his lips, sad, admiring. "That is a rare courage. Few would stand against the tide of gossip for a stranger's child. Few would have left him to die," she countered softly. He bowed his head. "You are right." For a moment their eyes met again, and the air between them thickened with an emotion neither dared name. Prudence felt it, the warmth creeping through her chest, the strange ache that came from being seen, truly seen, by someone she had expected to fear. When Nathaniel finally rose to leave, she followed him to the door. The light outside had dimmed to a silver dusk, and the clouds hung low over the hills. He paused on the threshold, looking back at her. "I would like to return tomorrow if you will allow it," he said quietly. "There is much to discuss, and I would like to see him again." Her instinct was to refuse, to protect the fragile peace she had built, but something in his voice disarmed her. It was not command, it was plea. "You may come," she said after a moment. "But understand this, Jonah is not an object to be inspected. He is a child, and I will not see him treated otherwise." "You have my word," he said, bowing his head. "I will show him only respect." As he stepped into the chill evening air, Prudence watched him walk down the path toward his carriage. His shoulders were straight, but his gait carried the heaviness of a man walking toward his own memories. She lingered at the doorway until the sound of wheels faded into silence. When she turned back inside, Jonah was awake, his eyes wide and curious. She lifted him into her arms and smiled faintly. "So," she murmured, "that was a marquess. He does not seem so fearsome after all." Jonah gurgled softly in response, and she laughed, though there was unease behind her laughter. She looked toward the fire, the shadows of the flames painting warmth across the walls. "Still," she whispered, "I wonder what secrets he carries behind those eyes." That night, sleep eluded her. She lay awake, listening to the rustle of the wind against the shutters. The image of Nathaniel kneeling by the cradle would not leave her mind, the way his voice had softened, the trembling of his hand as he touched Jonah's fingers, the grief in his eyes when he said, "He has her eyes." It was not the grief of guilt alone. It was something more intimate, more haunting. And though Prudence told herself she should not care, that the affairs of noblemen were far beyond her world, she could not deny the strange pull she felt. The memory of his voice lingered in her thoughts, deep and steady, like the echo of distant thunder. The next morning, she found herself tidying the cottage with unusual care. She told herself it was habit, nothing more. She brushed ash from the hearth, refolded the baby's blankets, and polished the small copper kettle until it gleamed. But when she caught her reflection in the window pane, her hair neatly pinned, her plain dress smoothed, she blushed at her own foolishness. When the knock came again near midday, she felt her pulse quicken. She opened the door to find Nathaniel standing there once more, his expression softened by something almost hesitant. This time, he carried no air of command. He held a small parcel in his hands. "I brought this," he said quietly. "Some linen and milk powder. I thought they might be of use." She looked at him, surprised. "You did not have to do that." "I know," he replied, "but I wanted to." Their eyes met, and for a moment the world outside the doorway seemed to vanish. The wind rustled through the hedgerows, and the faint scent of rain hung in the air. Prudence felt the warmth of something dangerous stir within her, an emotion she could neither name nor resist. "Thank you, my lord," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He inclined his head, his gaze steady, searching hers with quiet intensity. "You may call me Nathaniel," he said. The sound of his name on his own lips was intimate in a way that startled her. She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the door. "And you may call me Prudence." He smiled faintly. "Then, Prudence, may I come in?" She stepped aside, her heart fluttering in her chest as he entered. The moment their eyes met again across the small room, something irrevocable passed between them, something that neither time nor propriety could easily erase. And as the wind swept across the fields outside, the village unaware of what was beginning in that modest stone cottage, Prudence felt the first quiet tremor of a love that would change her life forever. For the next several days, the Marquess's visits became part of the rhythm of Prudence Whitcomb's life, as inevitable as dawn and just as quietly transformative. Each morning began the same way, the soft crackle of the fire, the scent of milk warming in the pot, Jonah's small laughter echoing through the cottage. But somewhere between the hours of noon and dusk, the sound of hooves would approach along the narrow lane, and Prudence's heart, against all sense and will, would falter. Nathaniel Ashcroft arrived each time with that same calm composure, his expression controlled, his gestures courteous. He never crossed the threshold without removing his gloves or inclining his head in quiet respect. Yet beneath that restraint was a warmth that grew more visible with every visit, a subtle, careful light that softened the hard lines of his face. He would kneel beside Jonah's cradle, watching the child with an intensity that spoke of reverence, not entitlement. Prudence would often stand a little apart, hands folded, her gaze half averted so as not to betray the emotion that threatened to rise whenever Nathaniel spoke to the child in that low, tender tone. "Look at him," he said one afternoon, his voice hushed. "He listens as though he understands every word." "He does," Prudence replied with a faint smile. "He knows more than we give him credit for." Their eyes met over the cradle. For a heartbeat, neither looked away. In that fragile silence, something trembled between them, an emotion unspoken but alive, delicate as a breath. Nathaniel's hand rested lightly on the edge of the cradle, his fingers only inches from hers. He did not move closer, yet the nearness itself was enough to set her pulse unsteady. Prudence turned back to the fire to hide the warmth in her cheeks. "He eats well now," she said softly. "The fever he caught last week has passed." "Because of you," he answered, his gaze never leaving her. She laughed faintly. "No, my lord, because he is strong. He has a will to live that cannot be taught. Strength alone does not heal a child," Nathaniel said quietly. "He thrives because you care for him, because you love him." The words lingered in the air like the echo of a confession. Prudence did not answer. She busied herself with folding one of Jonah's small linen cloths, her fingers trembling ever so slightly. Nathaniel rose and walked to the window. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun to dip behind the rolling hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. "This place," he murmured, "feels more like home than any estate I have ever owned." Prudence looked at him, her heart tightening at the sadness in his tone. "You sound lonely, my lord." He turned toward her, the light catching his face. "I have been lonely for longer than I care to admit, but here, in this cottage—" He paused, his voice faltering. "Here, I remember what peace feels like." Prudence felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. She tried to speak, but her voice caught. "Peace is a rare gift," she said finally. "We must guard it carefully." He smiled faintly, though his eyes remained serious. "And yet you live under constant judgment for doing what is right. You have peace only because you make it yourself." "That is the only kind worth having," she replied. For a long moment, neither spoke. The only sound was the faint crackle of the fire and Jonah's quiet breathing. When Nathaniel finally stepped closer, Prudence felt her heart begin to race again. He stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, the scent of his coat, oak and rain and faint tobacco. "Prudence," he said softly. Her name in his voice felt like a caress. She turned her head slowly, meeting his gaze. His expression was unreadable, an ache hidden behind restraint. For a breathless instant she thought he might reach for her, and though she told herself she would step away, her body betrayed her. She did not move. Then Jonah stirred, breaking the spell. Nathaniel stepped back, exhaling slowly. Prudence turned to lift the baby, her heart pounding so loudly she feared he might hear it. When she looked back, Nathaniel's composure had returned, though a trace of vulnerability lingered in his eyes. "I should not overstay my welcome," he murmured. "You are not unwelcome," she said before she could stop herself. The words hung between them, dangerous and sweet. Nathaniel's gaze softened. "Then I shall come again tomorrow." He left soon after, the echo of his departure lingering in the cottage long after his carriage vanished down the lane. Prudence stood by the window for a long time, Jonah in her arms, the light of the setting sun washing over her face. "You see, my little one," she whispered, "we are no longer alone, though I do not yet know if that is a blessing or a trial." The next morning dawned bright and cold. A thin frost sparkled across the fields, and the sound of bells from St. Bridget's drifted gently on the air. Prudence went about her chores with deliberate calm, though her thoughts wandered. She had begun to dread his absence and anticipate his presence with equal measure. It frightened her how much space his voice already occupied in her mind. He arrived at midday, carrying a small bundle wrapped in fine paper. "A gift," he said, his tone uncertain. "If you'll allow it." Prudence hesitated before unwrapping it. Inside lay a small carved rattle, polished smooth, with tiny bells that shimmered softly when shaken. Jonah's eyes widened at the sound, and Prudence laughed despite herself. "You'll spoil him," she chided gently. "He deserves to be spoiled," Nathaniel said, smiling. "Children should know joy before they learn the weight of the world." She met his gaze, and her laughter faded into something quieter. "You speak as though you remember that weight too well." "I do." His voice darkened. "I was raised to value duty above feeling, to serve the family name, not the heart." Prudence lowered her eyes. "That sounds like a cold way to live." "It was," he admitted. "Until recently, I believed myself numb to warmth. Then I met a woman who defied everyone for the sake of a helpless child." Her breath caught. She wanted to answer, to brush away the meaning in his words, but the sincerity in his tone rooted her in place. She turned to hide her blush, pretending to adjust Jonah's blanket. "It was not courage," he said softly. "It was instinct. Any woman with a heart would have done the same." "No," he said firmly, stepping closer. "Not any woman. Only you." The intensity of his gaze was too much. Prudence looked down, her hands trembling as she busied herself with the cradle. "You should not speak to me that way, my lord. People would misunderstand." "Then let them," he replied, his voice low and rough with feeling. She turned toward him, her grey-green eyes meeting his dark ones. "You know as well as I do that the world is unkind to women who defy its rules." "I know," he said, taking a slow breath, "but I also know that silence is a cruelty of its own." For a long, charged moment, they stood only a few feet apart, the air between them trembling with everything they could not say. The fire cast soft light across Nathaniel's face, tracing the lines of weariness and longing there. Prudence felt her defenses faltering, the walls she had built to protect herself beginning to crumble. Then a sudden knock shattered the fragile stillness. Startled, Prudence moved to the door. It was Reverend Pembroke, his hat clutched in his hands, his expression troubled. "Miss Whitcomb," he began, glancing uneasily at Nathaniel. "My lord, forgive the intrusion. There have been concerns." Nathaniel stiffened. "Concerns?" The vicar cleared his throat. "Certain members of the parish have expressed discomfort regarding your visits here, my lord. They fear impropriety." Nathaniel's eyes flashed. "Impropriety? Do they imagine I come to dishonor the woman who saved a child's life?" "Please, my lord," the Reverend said quickly, "I speak only out of duty. You must understand that gossip grows quickly in a place like this." Prudence's voice cut through the tension, calm and steady. "Thank you, Reverend. I understand your concern. You may tell them I have nothing to hide." The vicar looked unconvinced, but bowed and retreated, leaving an uneasy silence behind. Nathaniel turned back to Prudence, anger and guilt mingling in his expression. "I have brought you trouble. You have brought me no trouble that I did not already face," she said softly. "The village has long decided who I am. Your visits change nothing." "On the contrary," he murmured, his gaze burning into hers. "They have changed everything." She felt the truth of it in her pulse, in the unsteady rhythm of her breath. He stepped closer, too close, and for an instant it seemed the world itself held its breath. Prudence saw in his eyes the torment of a man caught between desire and restraint, between what was right and what was human. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "If I have overstepped, forgive me." "You have not," she said, her voice trembling, "but I fear you might." He smiled faintly, sad and tender. "Then I will leave before I do." He turned toward the door but paused, his hand resting on the latch. "May I return tomorrow?" She hesitated. Her heart cried yes, but her reason whispered no. In the end, she said softly, "Tomorrow, then." When he left, Prudence sank into the chair by the fire, Jonah sleeping peacefully beside her. The flames flickered against the window, casting golden light across the small room. She closed her eyes, pressing a hand to her chest as though to still the storm within her. Outside, the night deepened, wrapping the cottage in quiet. Yet within those walls, every shadow seemed to breathe his name, every heartbeat a whisper of something forbidden, beautiful, and dangerously alive. The next morning broke under a sky veiled in grey, the air cool and heavy with the scent of rain. Prudence Whitcomb rose early, as she always did, to tend to Jonah before the sun had even dared to pierce the horizon. The cottage glowed faintly with the warmth of the hearth. The baby's soft laughter filled the quiet room, a sound that never failed to remind her of hope, even when the world outside seemed eager to crush it. But that morning, something unsettled stirred in her chest, a heaviness that would not name itself. Nathaniel had not come the day before. It was the first day he had missed since his visits began. Prudence told herself it was nothing, that perhaps the rain had delayed him, that a man of his title had obligations she could not imagine. Yet as the hours stretched into the afternoon, the silence of his absence deepened into unease. When the knock finally came, it was sharper than usual, confident and deliberate. Prudence's pulse quickened. She wiped her hands on her apron and crossed the small room, expecting Nathaniel's familiar, quiet greeting. But the woman who stood at her door was a stranger. She was tall and elegant, her beauty the kind that demanded attention rather than asked for it. Her gown was of soft lavender silk, her gloves a pristine white, her posture impossibly straight. A delicate bonnet framed a face that might have been carved from marble, pale, symmetrical, and utterly cold. Only her eyes betrayed motion, an icy blue that glimmered with curiosity sharpened into disdain. "Miss Whitcomb, I presume?" the woman said, her tone smooth as satin and twice as cutting. "Yes," Prudence replied carefully. "And you are?" "Lady Celeste Ashcroft," she answered, offering no hand in greeting. "I am Lord Ashcroft's cousin." The world seemed to tilt slightly at those words. Prudence straightened instinctively, every instinct warning her that this woman's visit carried no kindness. "How may I help you, Lady Ashcroft?" "I believe," Celeste said, stepping past her without invitation, "that I have come to help you." Prudence closed the door quietly and turned to face her guest, who stood in the center of the small parlor, as though she were inspecting an exhibit. Her gaze drifted from the humble furniture to the cradle by the fire. When her eyes found Jonah, her brows lifted almost imperceptibly. "So it's true," she murmured. "He is here." Good Prudence moved instinctively closer to the cradle. "He is here," she said evenly, "and he is well cared for." Celeste's lips curved into a smile so refined it chilled the room. "How admirable. Though I wonder if you truly understand what you've entangled yourself in. I understand enough, Prudence replied. I doubt that, Celeste said lightly. My cousin, as you have seen, has a generous heart. Too generous, some might say. He tends to grow fond of lost causes. It would be tragic if that generosity were to lead him into disgrace. Prudence stiffened, the colour draining from her cheeks. My lady, if you've come to question my character, I suggest you save your breath. I have nothing to hide. Celeste turned to her, eyes glittering with amusement. Oh, my dear, I don't question your virtue. You are precisely what he finds so irresistible, plain, honest, unassuming, the kind of goodness men mistake for salvation. Prudence's hands trembled slightly, though she kept them hidden in the folds of her skirt. You speak as though you know him well. I do, Celeste replied. I was raised in the same house. I know the weight of the name he carries, and the ruin it would bring upon us all if that child were to be publicly acknowledged. Her words fell like shards of glass. Prudence's heart began to pound, but she lifted her chin with quiet strength. That child has done nothing to warrant ruin. He deserves protection, not shame. Celeste stepped closer, her perfume sweet and suffocating. Protection? From whom? From the world, or from the truth? Her voice softened, almost pitying. You must understand, my dear, that compassion has limits. Nathaniel is a marquess, and you, well, you are a village nurse. This attachment of his will only brings sorrow. For you, for him, for everyone. Prudence's voice trembled only slightly. If your concern is for his reputation, I assure you I want nothing from him. Not wealth, not favor, only peace for the child I saved. And yet he visits you every day, Celeste replied, her smile returning. Do you truly believe the village does not notice? Already tongues are wagging. Soon enough it won't be the child they whisper about. It will be you. Prudence's chest tightened, but she did not look away. Let them whisper. I have endured worse. Celeste studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. You are brave, she said at last. But bravery does not change reality. When this ends, and it will, you will be left with nothing but regret. She turned to leave, pausing by the door. Take my advice, Miss Whitcomb. When Nathaniel returns, remind him that kindness has its place and its price. The door closed softly behind her, leaving Prudence in silence. She stood motionless for several moments, her pulse still unsteady, the echo of Lady Celeste's words swirling in her mind like smoke. Jonah stirred in his cradle, sensing the tension in the air. Prudence knelt beside him, pressing her lips to his forehead. You needn't fear her, she whispered. No one will harm you while I draw breath. But even as she said the words, she felt a tremor of uncertainty. Celeste's visit had not been a warning. It had been a declaration of war. That evening, long after the sky had darkened and the hearth's embers glowed low, another knock came at the door. This time, the sound was hesitant. Prudence's heart leapt. She knew it before she opened it. Nathaniel stood there, his face drawn and weary, his dark hair damp from the mist. Forgive me for coming so late, he said quietly. I feared you might think I had forgotten you. I had begun to wonder, she admitted, stepping aside to let him in. He removed his gloves slowly, as though his thoughts weighed down every movement. I was detained at the estate. My cousin arrived unexpectedly from London. Prudence's pulse quickened. Lady Celeste. He looked up sharply. You've met her? Yes, she said, her tone calm, though her heart still ached with the memory. She came this afternoon. Nathaniel's expression hardened. Then I must apologize. She had no right to approach you. She came with purpose, my lord, and she spoke of ruin. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Celeste is clever, but she is also dangerous. She believes herself the guardian of our family's honor, as though the name Ashcroft was some sacred relic that must be protected from the touch of humanity. She spoke of the child, Prudence said softly. He turned toward the fire, his shoulders tense. Of course she did. To her, Jonah is not a child at all. He is a threat, proof of a secret the world was never meant to know. Prudence's voice broke the silence that followed. "And to you?" Nathaniel turned slowly, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "To me, he is the only truth left in a life built on lies." For a moment, the room seemed to still. The fire flickered between them, painting gold across his face, across the sorrow that lived in his eyes. Prudence stepped closer, her heart trembling. "Then do not let her silence you," she said. He gave a bitter smile. "You make it sound so simple, but I am bound by obligations you cannot imagine." "Perhaps," she replied softly, "but I know what it means to choose what is right over what is easy." Nathaniel studied her for a long moment, his jaw tightening as though he were struggling against something deep within him. Then he said, barely above a whisper, "You are braver than I." She shook her head. "No, my lord. I am only free of fear because I have nothing left to lose." "Ah, then you have everything," he murmured. The words hung between them, charged and tender. Prudence felt the air grow heavier, her heartbeat quickening as Nathaniel stepped closer. His hand lifted slightly as if he meant to touch her face, but stopped halfway, his fingers trembling in restraint. "Prudence," he said softly, her name falling from his lips like a confession. She could not breathe. Every part of her wanted to close the distance, to allow his touch, to surrender to the ache that had grown between them since the moment he first stepped into her home. But the memory of Lady Celeste's warning echoed in her mind, cold and cruel. "You should not," she whispered. "I know." They stood in silence, their eyes locked, their breaths shallow. The firelight trembled across their faces, the moment stretched thin as glass. Then, slowly, Nathaniel withdrew his hand and stepped back. "I cannot stay," he said quietly. "If she believes there is more between us than there should be, she will not rest until she destroys you. She already means to," Prudence replied. "Your absence will not change that." He closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though the truth pained him. "Then let me stay a little while, even if I should not." She did not answer. Instead, she moved to the cradle and lifted Jonah, cradling him against her shoulder. Nathaniel watched her, his gaze softening into something almost reverent. "You were meant for this," he said quietly, "for gentleness, for love." Her throat tightened. "And you, my lord, what were you meant for?" He hesitated, then whispered, "For regret." The silence that followed was too full, too heavy with the tenderness neither dared name. When Nathaniel finally left, Prudence stood by the door long after the sound of his carriage faded into the night. She pressed her forehead against the wooden frame and closed her eyes, her heart aching with the terrible sweetness of longing. In the cradle, Jonah slept peacefully, unaware of the storm gathering beyond the cottage walls. The kind of storm that begins not with thunder, but with a single trembling look. The night after Lady Celeste's visit lingered in Prudence's thoughts like a shadow that refused to lift. Every word, every glance from that pale, elegant woman had left behind an echo of unease. But it was not fear that kept Prudence awake. It was the way Nathaniel's voice had trembled when he spoke of secrets, of truths that were not his alone to share. The following morning dawned grey and still, the kind of English day where the clouds hung so low it felt as though heaven itself were listening. Prudence went about her chores quietly, her movements deliberate. She tidied the cottage, fed the hens, and rocked Jonah by the fire, though her heart was elsewhere. She had not seen Nathaniel since that fraught evening, and she told herself she did not expect him. But every sound outside, every carriage passing on the distant lane, made her turn toward the window. By mid-afternoon, when the faint sun began to glow weakly behind the mist, a familiar rhythm of hooves reached her ears. Her pulse quickened. She tried to still herself, to appear composed, yet when the knock came, a soft, deliberate sound, her hand trembled slightly on the latch. Nathaniel stood there, his dark coat damp from the fog, his expression grave but gentle. "May I come in?" he asked quietly. "You never need to ask," she said before she could stop herself. then looked away, flustered. "Forgive me. I meant, of course." He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The warmth of the cottage wrapped around them, and for a moment they stood in silence, the air charged with something that had no name. Nathaniel's gaze lingered on Jonah, who was sleeping peacefully in the cradle. "He's grown," he murmured. "He does that each day," Prudence said with a soft smile. "He eats as though he means to conquer the world." Nathaniel chuckled quietly, though the sound did not reach his eyes. He looked weary, his features shadowed by something more than fatigue. Prudence noticed the faint tension in his jaw, the way he held his hands clasped tightly behind his back. "You have something on your mind," she said gently. "Something you've come to say." He hesitated. "There are truths I have kept from you, not out of distrust, but because they are difficult to bear." Prudence's heart tightened. "Then tell me. I would rather face a painful truth than a comfortable lie." Nathaniel exhaled slowly, as though releasing a weight that had pressed on his chest for years. He walked toward the hearth, the firelight drawing a soft glow over the dark fabric of his coat. His voice, when it came, was quiet but steady. Her name was Amara. The name itself seemed to fill the room, gentle yet powerful, like a long-forgotten melody returning to memory. Prudence's breath caught. "The child's mother?" "Yes." His eyes lifted to hers. "Amara was not a servant, as my cousin would have you believe. She was the daughter of an English missionary and a woman from the West Indies. She came to England after her father's death, sent to live under the care of a distant relative. That relative was, unfortunately, connected to my family." He paused, his gaze distant. "I met her at a gathering in Bath. I remember the way she stood apart from the crowd, not from shyness, but from weariness. Society regarded her as an ornament, something exotic to admire from afar, but never to approach. I, fool that I was, thought my attention would shield her. I thought I could make her safe." Prudence's fingers tightened around the edge of the chair. "You loved her." "I did," he said simply, with all the reckless certainty of a man who had never been denied anything. "I believed love alone could change the world's cruelty. But love cannot silence power, and my family, Celeste among them, made certain of that." The fire popped softly, and outside, the faint call of a dove echoed across the hills. Nathaniel's eyes darkened with memory. "When she became with child, they acted swiftly. I was sent abroad under pretense of duty, my letters intercepted. When I returned, I was told she had left for the north, that she was well cared for. I believed them. Months later, word reached me that she had fallen ill and died, and that the child had not survived." His voice faltered. "I mourned them both. I buried them in my heart and tried to live as though I had not failed them, until I came here." Prudence's throat ached with unshed tears. She looked down at Jonah, sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm of history that had brought him to her. "And now you know the truth," she whispered. "Yes," Nathaniel said. "Now I know the truth, and the depth of my own cowardice." Prudence rose from her chair and crossed to him. "Do not call yourself a coward. You were deceived." "I should have known," he said bitterly. "I should have searched, demanded answers, fought for them both, but I let pride and fear chain me, and she paid for it." "Amara would not want your grief to consume you," Prudence said softly. "She would want her son to know love." Nathaniel looked at her then, his eyes searching hers. "And he does. You have given him what I could not, safety, warmth, a mother's devotion." Prudence felt her heart tighten. "He is mine only until the world claims him again." "No," Nathaniel said firmly, stepping closer. "He is ours to protect, both of us." The word ours hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Prudence looked away, but Nathaniel's hand moved, almost of its own accord, brushing lightly against her sleeve. It was the barest touch, a fleeting contact, yet it sent a tremor through her entire body. She met his gaze, and for a moment the distance between them vanished. She saw not a marquess bound by duty, but a man stripped of armor, trembling under the weight of redemption. "Prudence," he whispered. "If I had met you before, I might have believed in second chances." Her voice came out barely above a breath. "Do not say such things, my lord. They make hope dangerous." "Hope is already dangerous," he replied, his tone low, almost aching. "And yet, standing here with you, I find I cannot resist it." The silence between them deepened until it felt alive, fragile and beautiful. The fire crackled softly, its light catching the curve of her cheek, the line of his jaw. Their hands brushed again, this time not by accident but by choice. Prudence did not move away. "Tell me," she said quietly, her eyes still on the fire. "When you think of her, what do you remember?" Nathaniel's gaze softened. Her laughter, it was rare, but when it came it could silence a room. And her kindness, she carried it like light, even when the world tried to dim it. "You remind me of her." Prudence felt her heart ache at the words. "Then I envy her, for she knew you before the world hardened you." He smiled faintly, sadness in his eyes. "And I envy myself, for having known her at all." Jonah stirred then, breaking the spell. Prudence moved to the cradle, her movements tender, and Nathaniel watched her, an emotion rising in him that felt too large for words. As she settled the child back to sleep, he spoke softly. "You said earlier that you have nothing left to lose, but I fear that is no longer true. If harm were to come to you—" She turned toward him, her voice gentle but firm. "You cannot protect me from the world, Nathaniel. I have lived under its scrutiny all my life. What matters is that I can still look it in the eye." He smiled faintly, admiration glimmering behind his sorrow. "You have a courage I cannot match." "It is not courage," she said. "It is necessity. When a woman stands alone, she learns quickly that fear must never be visible." He stepped closer, and this time he did not stop himself. His hand lifted, brushing lightly against her cheek. The touch was feather-soft, reverent, almost uncertain. "You are remarkable," he murmured. Prudence's breath caught. "And you, my lord, are far too reckless." "Then perhaps," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "recklessness is what I need." For one trembling moment, the distance between them disappeared entirely. The air seemed to thrum with the weight of everything unsaid, the longing, the pain, the forbidden tenderness. Prudence's eyes closed, her heart racing, and when she opened them again, Nathaniel had stepped back, his composure restored, though his eyes betrayed the battle within him. "I must go," he said quietly. "If I stay, I will forget every reason I should not." Prudence's voice trembled. "And if you go, I will remember every reason I wish you had stayed." He looked at her for a long moment, his expression torn between duty and desire. Then he turned toward the door, his hand resting briefly on the latch. "I will return soon," he said softly. "There is still more to tell." When the door closed behind him, Prudence sank into her chair, her hand pressed to her heart. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. Jonah slept peacefully, his small face serene in the glow. Prudence whispered the name Nathaniel had spoken earlier, Amara, and felt the truth of it settle over her like a benediction. The child's mother had been loved once, fiercely and deeply, and now her son was loved again by a woman who had not meant to love at all. Outside, the mist thickened over the hills, cloaking the world in silence. And in that quiet, Prudence understood something she had not before. Love, even when forbidden, had a way of finding its path, through grief, through fear, through every barrier built to keep it from blooming. She lifted Jonah from his cradle, holding him close. "Your mother's name was Amara," she whispered softly, "and though I never knew her, I promise you this, I will protect what she left behind." As the night deepened and the fire faded to embers, Prudence closed her eyes, feeling the echo of Nathaniel's touch linger on her skin like a secret too precious to name. The rain began before dusk, soft at first, then heavier, washing over the thatched roofs and narrow lanes of the village. It drummed upon the windows of Prudence Whitcomb's cottage, a mournful rhythm that matched the ache in her chest. She had not seen Nathaniel for 2 days. 2 long, silent days in which every gust of wind against the shutters made her heart leap with hope, only to fall again when the knock did not come. She told herself she did not miss him, that his absence was necessary for them both. Yet her hands trembled when she poured her tea, and her thoughts wandered to the memory of his voice, the way it deepened when he said her name, the warmth of his eyes when he looked at Jonah. Outside, the grey sky bled into night. Prudence was rocking Jonah near the fire when the faint sound of hooves echoed through the rain. She froze. For a heartbeat she dared not move, scarcely breathing. Then came the knock, firm but weary. When she opened the door, Nathaniel stood before her, his coat soaked, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. The storm had followed him, yet in his eyes there burned something steadier than fire. "Forgive me," he said softly. "I could not stay away." Without a word, she stepped aside. He entered, water dripping from his coat, the scent of rain and earth following him in. She closed the door, the thunder fading behind them, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. "You'll catch your death," she murmured, moving quickly to fetch a towel. "You should have waited until morning." "I tried," he said with a faint smile, his voice low and rough. But the waiting was worse than the storm. Her heart faltered at the confession. She busied herself by the hearth, spreading his coat before the fire. "Sit, my lord," she said softly. "You look exhausted." He obeyed, his long frame sinking into the chair near the flames. Steam rose from his clothes, his breath visible in the cool air. Prudence handed him a towel, avoiding his gaze as she spoke. "You should not have come. The village will talk." "They already do," he replied quietly. "Let them." Prudence turned sharply, her expression strained. "You say that as though words cannot wound, but they can destroy, Nathaniel." He looked up, his eyes dark with determination. "I have been destroyed before, Prudence. The difference is that this time it would be for something worth the ruin." She stood frozen, the towel clutched in her hands. "You speak as though I were reason enough to risk your name." "You are," he said simply. Her breath caught. For a long, trembling moment, they stared at one another, the fire crackling softly between them. Jonah stirred in his cradle, and Prudence turned away, her heart pounding so fiercely she feared he might hear it. "Why do you make it so difficult to keep distance?" she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Because I have spent years living in distance," he said, "and I cannot bear it any more." Prudence faced him then, her eyes glistening in the firelight. "You think you suffer alone, but you do not. I wake each morning, torn between what I feel and what I know to be right. And yet here you stand, drenched and stubborn, asking me to forget every boundary that keeps us decent." He rose slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. "I am not asking you to forget," he said softly, "only to see what already exists between us." She shook her head, her voice breaking. "What exists between us cannot survive the world beyond these walls." "Then let the world fall away," he murmured. For a moment she wanted to believe it, to imagine that love, simple and defiant, could silence everything else. But reason pulled her back, cruel and cold. She stepped back, her voice barely above a whisper. "You are a marquess, Nathaniel. I'm a woman who has already been judged for less than this." He closed the space between them, his voice trembling with restraint. "Titles and judgment mean nothing when I am near you. You have given me back what I thought I had buried forever, hope, purpose, a reason to feel alive again." She looked up at him, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "You should not say such things." "And yet," he said, his tone gentler now, "I cannot stop saying them." Their gazes locked, and the air seemed to still. The tension between them was a living thing, fragile, trembling, yet undeniable. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers, hesitant but desperate. "Tell me to leave," he whispered, "and I will." Prudence's lips parted, but no sound came. Her fingers, trembling, did not pull away. Nathaniel's breath hitched, his hand still resting against hers. "You will not," he said softly, "because you feel it too." Her eyes closed, a tear escaping down her cheek. "I feel it," she whispered, "and it terrifies me." He lifted a hand, brushing the tear away with his thumb, his touch reverent. "As it terrifies me," he murmured, "but fear cannot change what is true." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the thunder's distant rumble and the fragile sound of their breathing. He lowered his hand slowly, his gaze still on her face. "I came tonight not only because I could not stay away," he said. "I came because there is more you must know." Prudence steadied herself. "Another secret?" "Yes," he said, "and it concerns Jonah." Her heart froze. "What about him?" Nathaniel hesitated, as though gathering the strength to continue. "Celeste returned to London after her visit, but she did not leave quietly. She intends to challenge the boy's existence, to expose him as a scandal if I do not renounce all claim to him." "Lo!" Prudence's face drained of color. "Expose him? How could she? He is an innocent child." "Because she believes that destroying me will preserve our family's name," he said bitterly. "And she knows the surest way to do that is through him." Prudence's hands clenched at her sides. "Then she must not find him." Nathaniel stepped closer, his expression tormented. "That is why I came. I may have to remove him from here, temporarily, until I can silence her." The words struck her like a blow. "Remove him," she repeated, her voice barely steady. "You would take him from me." "I do not wish to," he said quickly. "But if she sends word to the magistrate, you could be accused of theft, of concealing a child not your own. They would destroy you, Prudence. I could not bear that." Her heart pounded wildly. "You think I care what they accuse me of? That I would hand him over to protect myself?" "Prudence, please," he said, his voice raw. "I am trying to protect you both." "By tearing us apart," she cried, her voice breaking. "Do you not understand? He is all I have." Nathaniel's composure shattered. "And you are all I have left," he said hoarsely. The words hung between them, trembling like something sacred. Prudence's breath caught, and in that moment all restraint fell away. He stepped forward, his hands trembling as they reached for hers, and though her mind screamed that it was folly, her heart yielded. Their fingers intertwined, and for a heartbeat the storm outside seemed to quiet. He looked down at her, his gaze full of anguish and longing. "Forgive me," he whispered. "I have no right to feel this, nor I to return it," she said softly. And yet they stood there, unable to move, the firelight casting their shadows together against the wall. His thumb brushed the back of her hand, a touch so light it felt like a promise. "Tell me," she whispered, "if you had met me before her, before all of this, what then?" He smiled faintly, sorrow in his eyes. "Then I would have married you and never let you go." A tear slipped down her cheek. "You speak as though love were so simple." "It is not," he said, "but it is the only thing that feels true." Their foreheads nearly touched now, breaths mingling in the still air. Every inch of space between them pulsed with the ache of what could not be spoken. Then slowly, as though afraid to break the fragile spell, Nathaniel stepped back. "If I must take Jonah," he said softly, "it will be only for a short while. I will bring him back to you as soon as it is safe." Prudence nodded, though her eyes glistened with tears. "Then promise me one thing," she said. "Promise me he will never grow up ashamed of who he is." Nathaniel's gaze softened. "I promise." They stood there for a long while, the rain whispering against the window, the fire burning low. Neither wanted the moment to end, for they both knew the dawn would bring separation. When he finally left, Prudence followed him to the door. He turned once more, his eyes filled with everything he could not say. "Whatever happens," he said quietly, "remember this night. Remember that you are not alone in this world." Her voice trembled. "And you, Nathaniel, remember that love, once awakened, cannot die, no matter the distance." He hesitated, as though those words had bound him to her beyond the reach of time. Then he bowed his head slightly, a gesture more intimate than a kiss, and stepped out into the storm. Prudence closed the door and leaned against it, her chest rising and falling with unsteady breaths. The thunder rolled across the hills, fading into silence. She looked toward Jonah's cradle, where he slept peacefully, unaware of the promises made over his small life. Prudence wiped her tears and whispered into the quiet, "He will come back." And as the last embers of the fire glowed in the hearth, she believed it, not because of faith in destiny, but because she had seen the truth in Nathaniel's eyes. Love, when born of pain and courage, was stronger than fear, stronger than scandal, stronger than the storm itself. The morning after the storm arrived with a fragile, deceptive calm. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of wet earth and rain-soaked grass. Mist clung to the fields like a shroud, veiling the world in muted grey. Prudence Whitcomb stood by the window, her hands resting on the sill, her eyes tracing the faint outline of the hills beyond. The horizon looked uncertain, blurred between earth and sky, like the life she now faced. Jonah stirred in his cradle, letting out a soft cry that broke the silence. Prudence turned at once, gathering him into her arms with the instinctive tenderness that had come to define her every breath. "Hush, my darling," she whispered, rocking him gently. "The day has barely begun." Yet even as she soothed him, her heart was far from calm. Nathaniel's words from the previous night lingered in her mind, the quiet desperation in his voice when he said he must take the child, the promise that it would only be for a short while. She had told herself that she would be brave, that her trust in him was stronger than her fear. But in the soft light of morning, courage felt like a fragile thing. A knock at the door shattered her thoughts. Her arms tightened instinctively around Jonah. She already knew who it would be. She took a deep breath, kissed the baby's forehead, and walked to the door. Nathaniel stood there, his dark coat freshly dried, but his eyes shadowed, weary with the weight of what he must do. Behind him the mist curled along the lane, soft and haunting. He removed his hat slowly, as though uncertain whether he deserved to enter. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice rough. Prudence stepped aside. "You may." The cottage felt smaller with him inside, or perhaps it was the gravity of the moment that made the walls seem to close in around them. Nathaniel looked at Jonah, his gaze softening even as his jaw tightened. "He looks well," he said quietly. "You've given him everything I could not." "You gave him life," Prudence replied. "I merely kept it safe." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for a heartbeat she thought she saw regret flicker across his face, like a wound reopened. "If there were another way," he began. "There isn't," she finished for him. "I know." They stood in silence for a long time, the only sound, the faint crackle of the fire, and Jonah's quiet cooing. Prudence finally turned toward the cradle, laying the child down with care, as though each movement might delay the inevitable. "You said you would keep him safe," she said softly. "Promise me that again." "I promise," Nathaniel said at once. "On my honor, Prudence, I will protect him with my life." She nodded, but did not turn. "Your cousin will not rest, will she?" "No," he admitted. "Celeste believes she is preserving the family's name. She has already sent word to London. She intends to make her accusations public within the fortnight. I must leave before she acts. If Jonah is here when her messengers arrive, you will be blamed. They will call you a thief." "I care little for what they call me," Prudence said, turning to face him. "But I cannot bear the thought of him being torn from me by strangers." "He won't be," Nathaniel said firmly. "He will go with me to my estate in Somerset. No one there will question his presence. He will be safe until I can silence her." Her heart clenched at his words. "Safe," she repeated faintly, "but without me." Nathaniel stepped forward, his voice breaking. "You have my word. I will bring him back. I cannot ask you to trust the world, Prudence, but trust me." She met his gaze, her eyes shimmering. "I already do. That is what makes this so cruel." Nathaniel's hand lifted, trembling as it brushed her cheek. "You have given me more faith than I deserve. I will not betray it." Prudence closed her eyes, leaning ever so slightly into his touch. For a moment, the world narrowed to the warmth of his palm, the faint scent of rain still clinging to him, the unspoken promise hanging in the air. When she opened her eyes again, she saw his pain mirrored in her own. "Will you let me hold him?" he asked quietly. She hesitated, then nodded. Gently she lifted Jonah and placed him in Nathaniel's arms. The Marquis looked down at the small face nestled against him, his expression one of awe and sorrow. "He has her eyes," he whispered, his voice trembling, "and her strength." Prudence watched him, her heart breaking in silence. "And your gentleness," she said softly, "though you hide it well." Nathaniel looked up, their gazes meeting over the sleeping child. "You see more of me than anyone ever has." Her voice was steady, though her hands trembled. "That is because I look without expectation." He smiled faintly, the expression fleeting. "And yet I fear I have come to expect too much of you." Prudence shook her head. "You have asked nothing I would not give freely." Their words fell into quietness. Nathaniel turned his gaze back to Jonah, his fingers tracing the curve of the child's small hand. The fire crackled softly, and the mist pressed against the window, turning the outside world into a blur. "When will you leave?" Prudence asked at last. "Before nightfall," he said. "The roads will be empty by then, and the rain will mask our tracks." "So soon," she murmured, her voice breaking on the words. "I dare not stay longer," he said. "Each hour here endangers you." She swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on the child in his arms. "Then allow me one thing. Let me walk with you to the old willow by the bridge. That is far enough." Nathaniel hesitated, then nodded. "If you wish it." The hours that followed passed in a haze. Prudence moved through her cottage as though in a dream, folding Jonah's small linens, tucking away the rattle Nathaniel had brought weeks ago, kissing the curls at the crown of the baby's head again and again, as if trying to memorize the scent of him. When the time came, the rain had lessened to a fine mist. The three of them, woman, man, and child, walked along the narrow lane toward the bridge. The air was cool, the sky pale with the fading light of evening. The fields stretched silent around them, their quiet broken only by the steady sound of their footsteps on the wet earth. At the bend in the road stood the old willow, its branches drooping low over the water like threads of silver. Prudence stopped there, unable to take another step. Nathaniel turned toward her, Jonah still sleeping peacefully against his chest. "This is far enough," she whispered. Nathaniel nodded, his throat tight. He shifted Jonah carefully in his arms, cradling the child with infinite care. "He'll never remember this," he said softly. "But I will." Prudence's eyes filled with tears. "Tell him, when he is older, that he was loved every day of his life. Tell him that he was never abandoned, not even for a moment." "I will," Nathaniel said, "and when it is safe, he will return to you. That is my vow." Her lips trembled as she reached out, brushing a hand across Jonah's soft cheek. "My sweet boy," she whispered, "be brave. The world is cruel, but you must meet it with gentleness. That will be your strength." Nathaniel watched her, his own composure crumbling. "Prudence." She looked up at him, tears streaking her face. "If you speak my name like that, I will never let you go." He took a step closer, his free hand finding hers. "Then don't," he said. "Say the word, and I'll stay." Her heart clenched at the temptation. She wanted to say it, to command the world to stop, to defy reason, to live only for this moment. But she knew that love, to be worthy, must sometimes bear the weight of sacrifice. She drew in a trembling breath. "No," she whispered. "You must go." Nathaniel closed his eyes, his forehead resting briefly against hers. "You have changed me," he murmured. "Before you, I existed only out of duty. Now I live because of you." She reached up, her fingers brushing the damp hair from his brow. "Then live well, Nathaniel. For him, for what we cannot have." He kissed her hand then, not with passion, but with reverence, as if sealing a vow. "You have my heart," he said, "and you always will." When he stepped away, the space between them felt vast. Though it was only a few feet, he looked down at Jonah once more, then at her. "I will send word when it is safe," he said softly. Prudence nodded, unable to speak. The wind stirred the willow branches above them, the sound like a whisper of farewell. She watched as Nathaniel turned and began to walk down the path, his figure growing smaller against the mist. Jonah's faint cry carried back to her, and she pressed her hand to her lips, stifling a sob. When they disappeared beyond the curve of the road, she sank to her knees beneath the willow, her tears falling silently onto the wet grass. She did not weep like a woman broken, but like one who had given everything she had to love. The mist thickened around her, soft and grey. In the stillness, she whispered to the wind, "Come back to me." And though no answer came, she felt the echo of his promise in the air, as real and fragile as the memory of his touch. As night descended over the Cotswolds, the cottage on the hill stood dark and quiet, the cradle empty for the first time in months. Yet even in that emptiness, something remained, a warmth, a light that could not be extinguished, because love, once born, never truly departs. It lingers in the air, in the earth, in every heartbeat that dares to remember. Weeks had passed since that night beneath the willow, yet time had not dulled the ache that lived in Prudence Whitcomb's heart. The cottage felt emptier with each sunrise, its silence pressing against her like an invisible weight. Every morning she awoke to the same cruel stillness, her arms instinctively reaching for the cradle before she remembered it was empty. Jonah's laughter, once the melody of her days, had become an echo that haunted the corners of her memory. She busied herself with work to fill the hours, mending, tending to the sick in the village, walking the meadows where wildflowers struggled against the frost. But none of it quieted the longing. And though she told herself that Nathaniel Ashcroft would keep his promise, there were nights when doubt crept in, like a cold draught under the door. The villagers, ever alert to gossip, had softened toward her since the Marquess's departure. Some pitied her, others spoke kindly of her courage, but every word, every sympathetic glance only deepened her solitude. For none of them knew that her heart lived elsewhere, in the arms of a man burdened by duty, in the laughter of a child who had carried her soul with him into the world beyond her reach. It was on an afternoon, heavy with rain, that the knock finally came. Prudence froze, her needle suspended mid-stitch. She waited, hardly daring to breathe. When the sound came again, a gentle, deliberate tapping, her heart began to race. She rose slowly, every movement deliberate, as if fearing that one wrong step would break the fragile hope blooming within her chest. When she opened the door, no one stood there. Only the grey drizzle and the scent of damp earth greeted her. But at her feet lay an envelope sealed in red wax, stamped with the crest of the Ashcroft family, a lion and a crown intertwined. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up. She closed the door, moved to the table by the window and broke the seal. Inside was a single folded letter, the paper thick and finely pressed. She unfolded it with care, her breath catching as she saw his handwriting. "My dearest Prudence, if this reaches you, know that my heart has never been far from you, no matter the distance. The days since I left have been long and cruel, for each moment without your voice feels like a wound that refuses to heal. Jonah is well. He grows stronger with every passing day, his laughter bright as sunlight after rain. You would be proud of him as I am proud of you. But I write to you now, not only to bring comfort, but to warn you. My cousin Celeste has returned from London with renewed venom. She has sought the ear of the bishop, and whispers of inquiry reach even Somerset. I fear she means to strike, not through me, but through you. If she learns that you defied her decree, that you were the one who kept the child alive, she will use it to destroy your good name. I am doing all I can to prevent it, but if you hear rumors, if you sense danger, leave the village at once. There are friends of mine in Bath who will shelter you. Enclosed is a note of passage in my hand. Pray, Prudence, do not take this as farewell. When all is safe again, I shall return for you. You have my word and my heart, both of which belong wholly to you. Until that day, I remain yours in love and faith, Nathaniel." The paper trembled in her hands. She pressed it to her chest, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Yours in love and faith, she whispered, as though the words themselves might summon him. For a long while she sat by the fire, reading the letter again and again until she could recite it by heart. Each word felt like a touch, a breath, a confession spoken across the miles. Yet beneath the comfort of his affection lay the echo of fear. If Lady Celeste truly meant to ruin her, then the peace of her small life was already over. That evening the sky darkened early. The rain had stopped, but the air carried the chill of something foreboding. Prudence lit her lamp and placed it by the window, as she had every night since his departure. A silent beacon, a promise that she would be waiting. Its warm glow flickered against the mist, reaching toward the unseen hills. She sat at her table, the letter before her, the fire crackling low. Her thoughts drifted to Nathaniel, where he might be, what he might be enduring for the sake of honor and protection. And though she longed for him with every fiber of her being, she prayed, not for his return, but for his safety. The following day, she went to the churchyard to clear her mind. The grass was slick beneath her boots, the air thick with the scent of rain and stone. As she walked between the weathered gravestones, she paused beneath the old oak, the one where she had first found Jonah. She knelt, her fingers brushing the damp earth. "You began here," she whispered softly. "Perhaps all things do." A voice behind her made her start. "Talking to the wind again, Miss Whitcomb." She turned to find Reverend Pembroke standing a few steps away, his kind eyes studying her with concern. "Forgive me," she said quickly. "I did not hear you approach." He smiled faintly. "You've had much on your mind of late. The village worries for you." "I am well," she lied. He hesitated. "There are whispers, Prudence, about the Marquess, about the child. You must be cautious." Her heart clenched. "Whispers mean little, Reverend. They fade with time." He sighed. "I pray you are right." When he walked away, Prudence remained beneath the tree, her hands clasped tightly. She knew now that Nathaniel's warning had not been an exaggeration. The whispers had reached even here. That night, as the wind rose again, she sat by the fire with his letter open beside her. Her eyes traced his words as though they might form a bridge across the distance that divided them. She imagined him reading by candlelight, his brow furrowed, his fingers ink-stained. She imagined him looking out of a window much like hers, wondering if she could still feel his heart from afar. A knock startled her. It was soft but deliberate, the sound of someone cautious. She hesitated, clutching the letter to her chest. "Who is it?" "Henry Trask," came the muffled reply. He was a stable hand from the Ashcroft estate, a man she recognized from Nathaniel's earlier visits. She opened the door, the wind rushing in. Henry stood there, hat in hand, his clothes damp with mist. "Beg pardon, Miss Whitcomb," he said quietly. "His lordship sends this." He handed her a small wooden box, bound with twine. "Did he write?" she asked, breathless. "No, miss. Only said to give you this, and to tell you that the truth always finds its light." Before she could question him further, he bowed and turned away, disappearing into the fog. Prudence closed the door and set the box on the table. Her fingers shook as she untied the twine and lifted the lid. Inside lay a small brass lantern, polished until it gleamed, and beneath it a folded note in Nathaniel's hand. "For the nights when my absence feels too heavy, light this, and know that somewhere I do the same. As long as our flames burn, we are not apart." Prudence's tears fell freely then, silent and unchecked. She held the lantern close, its weight solid, reassuring. That night she lit it beside the window, the soft golden glow mingling with the flicker of the fire. Outside, the mist swirled around the glass like a veil, but the light shone steady, unwavering. In that small room, surrounded by shadows and silence, she felt him, not in presence but in spirit, in the warmth that spread through her chest, in the memory of his voice when he had whispered her name like a prayer. Days turned into weeks, and the world outside began to change with the season. Winter crept in with its silver frost, the fields blanketed in white. Yet every evening, without fail, Prudence lit the lantern by her window. The villagers came to call it the widow's light, though none knew its true story. Some said it was for a lost child. Others whispered it was for a man gone to war. Only Prudence knew it was both and neither. It was love, steadfast and unyielding, burning quietly against the darkness, and somewhere beyond the hills, in a grand house where duty warred with the heart, another lantern burned in answer. Nathaniel Ashcroft would stand by its glow long after midnight, his thoughts travelling to a cottage miles away, to a woman who had changed him in ways the world would never understand. He would whisper her name, not to the walls, but to the light itself, believing that somehow, through the quiet miracle of love, she might hear him. That night, as Prudence watched the flame dance within the lantern, she smiled through her tears. "We are not apart," she murmured, "not truly." And though the wind howled and the world remained uncertain, the light stayed steady, two souls bound by faith and fire, reaching for each other across the distance, their love defying every shadow the world could cast. The first thing Prudence noticed that morning was the silence. Not the ordinary hush of a village waking, no distant carts, no clink of pails, no sleepy calls across hedgerows, but a silence sharpened into purpose, as if the whole world had paused to watch what would happen at her door. She rose before the sun, as she always did, and lit the fire with hands that refused to tremble. The cottage felt too large without Jonah's breathing, too empty without the small, steady weight of him against her shoulder. Yet she had learned in these weeks of waiting that emptiness did not mean defeat. It only meant love had gone ahead of her, making a path. She placed Nathaniel's brass lantern on the windowsill and lit it with a single match. The flame caught instantly, warm and steady, painting a soft gold along the glass. She stared at it for a long moment, her throat tight. "As long as our flames burn," she whispered, "we are not apart." Outside, the sky was the colour of pewter. A thin fog drifted over the lane. Prudence wrapped her cloak around her shoulders and stepped into the chill to fetch water from the pump, her boots sinking slightly into damp earth. She had barely lifted the bucket when she heard it. Wheels. Not the gentle creak of a farmer's cart, not the familiar rhythm of local trade. This was heavier, more deliberate, the sound of authority arriving in polished leather and iron certainty. Prudence's breath caught. She set the bucket down without spilling and turned slowly toward the lane. A carriage emerged from the fog like a threat made visible, dark, lacquered sides glistening with moisture. Two riders followed behind, one in a plain coat with the stiff posture of an officer, another holding reins with the practiced indifference of a man paid not to care. The carriage rolled to a stop before her cottage, as though it had always belonged there. The door opened, and Lady Celeste stepped out. Even in the grey light, Celeste looked unreal. Cold elegance, wrapped in dark velvet, her bonnet pinned precisely, her gloves spotless, as if dirt itself dared not touch her. She did not glance at the sky or the mud beneath her boots. Her gaze went straight to Prudence, with the calm of someone who believed the world would move aside when she spoke. Behind her, a magistrate descended with a paper case tucked under his arm, and at his heel a constable shifted his weight, eyes wary. Celeste's smile appeared smooth as polished steel. "Miss Whitcomb." Prudence returned her gaze without flinching. "Lady Celeste." "I see you have remained where you are," Celeste said, as though Prudence were a misplaced object that should have been removed weeks ago. How stubbornly sentimental! Prudence did not step back. "If you have come to admire my sentiment, you've chosen a poor morning." The magistrate cleared his throat, uncomfortable already. "Miss Whitcomb, I have received a formal inquiry regarding a child formerly in your care. You are to answer a few questions, and you are to surrender any correspondence that concerns the boy's identity." Prudence felt cold spread through her chest, but she kept her voice even. "The child is not here." Celeste's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Of course he isn't. That is the point. He has been concealed, moved, hidden like contraband. And you helped." "I saved him," Prudence said, each word steady as stone. I fed him when he was near death. I kept him warm when the world chose to look away." Celeste drifted closer, her tone lowering into something almost intimate. "You will find, Miss Whitcomb, that virtue is a poor shield when the law is tired of being challenged. Tell the magistrate where the child is now, and you may yet keep what little respectability you have left." Prudence's jaw tightened. "You speak of respectability as if it were mercy. It is not. It is a currency you hoard to purchase silence." Celeste's smile sharpened. "And you speak as if you matter." The insult was delivered with such precision it might have wounded someone else. Prudence only lifted her chin. "I matter enough that you came yourself." A flicker passed through Celeste's eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, or fear that Prudence was not bending the way she should. She turned slightly to the magistrate. "Proceed." He opened his case, removing papers. "Miss Whitcomb, do you possess any letters from Lord Ashcroft?" Prudence thought of Nathaniel's letter hidden in her sewing box, the words pressed into her heart like vows. She could feel its weight even from across the room. If she surrendered it, Celeste would twist it into proof of impropriety. If she refused, they would call her defiant. Before she could answer, another voice cut through the fog like a blade of truth. "You will not take so much as a ribbon from her home." Prudence's breath caught. She turned slowly, and there, through the thinning mist, came another carriage. Not the one Celeste had brought, not a hired vehicle of cold intent, but a carriage that moved with quiet confidence. It rolled forward and stopped behind Celeste's, as though placing itself between Prudence and ruin. The door opened. Nathaniel stepped out. He looked different than he had weeks ago, still composed, still unmistakably noble, but as if something inside him had finally broken free of its chains. His coat was dark, tailored, immaculate, yet his face carried the raw honesty of a man who had decided to stop hiding. In his arms, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, was Jonah. Prudence forgot how to breathe. The world narrowed to the sight of the child's small face nestled against Nathaniel's chest, the soft curl of his fingers clutching the lapel of the Marquess's coat, the faint movement of his mouth, as if dreaming. Jonah was here. Jonah was safe. Jonah was alive in front of her again. Prudence's knees weakened. She gripped the edge of the pump to steady herself. Nathaniel walked forward, every step deliberate, his gaze fixed on Prudence first, only Prudence, before shifting to Celeste, then the magistrate. Celeste's composure wavered for the first time. "Nathaniel, you are making a spectacle." "I am making the truth visible," he replied, his voice low and unwavering, "something you have spent years trying to prevent." He stopped before Prudence, close enough that she could smell the faint scent of travel on him, clean leather, cold air, something like cedar. Jonah stirred at the sound of her breath and opened his eyes. When he saw her, his face softened, and he made a small sound that was not quite a cry, not quite a laugh, only recognition. Prudence's vision blurred. Nathaniel's gaze moved over her face as if he were memorizing her again. "I came as quickly as I could," he said softly. "I should have come sooner." She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. All she could manage was, "You brought him back." "I told you I would," he murmured, and the tenderness in his tone was a dangerous kind of devotion. Quiet, unashamed, impossible to deny. Then he turned to the magistrate and held up a sealed packet. "You came for papers," he said. "Here are papers." The magistrate blinked, startled. "My lord, You will read them," Nathaniel said calmly, "because they contain sworn statements regarding the child's abandonment, the interception of my correspondence, and the attempts made to remove the boy unlawfully from the woman who kept him alive." Celeste's smile returned, thinner now. "You are accusing your own blood of wrongdoing." Nathaniel's gaze did not waver. "I'm accusing you of cruelty." He stepped forward, extending the packet to the magistrate. "This includes the testimony of Henry Trask, who delivered my messages and witnessed the pressure placed on Miss Whitcomb. It includes the statement of my former steward, Thomas Grafton, who admits he carried letters at your direction, letters meant to keep me from the truth. He has confessed in writing with witnesses. Celeste's face tightened. Grafton is a weak man who will say anything to save himself. Then let him say it before the law, Nathaniel replied. In London if necessary, in court if it must be, but he will not say it in whispers any more. The magistrate hesitated, then opened the packet. His eyes moved quickly over the pages, the colour draining from his face with each line. Prudence watched, her heart hammering. She understood enough, names, dates, signatures, to see the shape of what Nathaniel had done. He had not merely returned, he had returned armed with truth. The constable shifted, uncertain. Celeste's eyes flashed with rage. Nathaniel, you are destroying yourself. Nathaniel looked at her with an exhaustion that felt older than their years. No, he said, I am ending what you built. He took one slow breath, then stepped closer to Prudence again. His voice softened, but it carried in the open air, steady and clear. This woman saved my son. A collective inhale seemed to move through the village, because they had gathered now, neighbours standing at a distance, drawn by the sight of carriages and authority, by the pull of scandal. Faces appeared behind curtains, and along the lane, eyes wide, mouths covered by hands. Prudence's cheeks burned, but she did not lower her gaze. Nathaniel continued, his hand tightening gently around Jonah's blanket. His mother's name was Amara. She was taken from me by lies and silence. Jonah was taken as well. I believed them dead because I was made to believe it. That ends today. Celeste stepped forward, her voice sharp. You cannot say such things aloud. You cannot bind the family to... I bind myself, Nathaniel cut in, and I will take the consequences. He turned fully to the villagers, his posture straight, his voice carrying without cruelty, but without fear. You have judged Miss Whitcomb for mercy. If you wish to judge, then judge me as well. This child will not be hidden, he will not be erased, he will be protected, provided for, and loved in the open. Prudence felt something inside her crack. Not pain, but relief so profound it hurt. Nathaniel looked back at her then, and the air between them changed. It was no longer only about Jonah, it was about the way he looked at her, as if she were not a convenience, not a scandal, not a temporary kindness, as if she were home. He stepped closer, until only inches separated them. Jonah's little hand reached toward Prudence, and she lifted her fingers, letting the child grasp them. The touch, small, warm, felt like life returning to her body. Nathaniel's voice lowered, meant only for her, though the world might have been listening for all she cared. I will not ask you to sacrifice again, he whispered, not without giving you something in return. Her eyes widened. Nathaniel. He shook his head slightly, as if to silence every fear she had ever carried. I have spent too long letting others decide what is allowed. I will not do that any more. He held her gaze, his expression trembling with restraint and truth. Prudence Whitcomb, he said louder now, and the sound of her full name on his lips made her heart twist. Will you marry me? A sound escaped someone in the crowd, a gasp perhaps, or a murmured prayer. Prudence heard none of it. She only saw him. The man who had come drenched in rain to confess his heart. The man who had carried her child back through fog and scandal and law. The man who stood before her with his dignity stripped bare, offering not protection as a cage, but partnership as a vow. Her voice shook. You cannot do this for pity. I would rather die than pity you, he said, and the fierceness in his tone made her breath catch. I do it because I love you, because when you held my son, you held what was left of my soul. Because the thought of a future without you feels like punishment. Tears spilled down her cheeks. And what of your world? She whispered. What of their scorn? Nathaniel's thumb brushed her knuckles, the simplest touch, yet it carried everything. Let them scorn. I will still wake each morning grateful you exist. Prudence looked down at Jonah's fingers around hers, then back into Nathaniel's eyes. She felt, with startling clarity, the truth that had been growing in her since the day she found the baby beneath the churchyard wall. Love had already chosen her. The only question was whether she would refuse it out of fear. She lifted her chin, her voice soft but unwavering. "Yes," she whispered, "I will marry you." Nathaniel's breath broke, like a man who had been holding it for years. He did not kiss her, not there, not before the magistrate and the villagers and Celeste's fury. Instead, he pressed his forehead to hers for the briefest moment, as if sealing a promise with a touch too sacred for spectacle. "Thank you," he breathed, and it sounded like salvation. Celeste's composure fractured. "This is madness," she hissed, her eyes glittering. "You will regret it." Nathaniel turned to her, his voice calm. "No, I regret only what I did not do sooner." The magistrate cleared his throat, still holding the papers. "My lord, given what I have read, there will be no action taken against Miss Whitcomb. The inquiry is resolved." Celeste stared at him as though he had betrayed her. "You cannot simply—" "I can," the magistrate said stiffly, uncomfortable under Nathaniel's gaze and the weight of written confession. "And I will." Celeste's lips pressed into a thin line. For a moment she looked at Prudence with hatred so cold it felt like winter itself. Then she turned sharply, climbing into her carriage without another word. The door slammed, wheels rolled. The dark carriage disappeared into the fog, retreating like a storm that had failed to break the house it meant to destroy. When she was gone, something loosened in the village air. People shifted, uncertain. A few faces softened. One older woman, Mrs. Keene from the bakery, lifted her hand to her mouth, eyes wet. Reverend Pembroke appeared at the edge of the gathering, his expression stunned and moved. He stepped forward slowly. "My lord," he said, voice trembling, "if you mean what you have spoken." "I do," Nathaniel replied. The Reverend looked at Prudence then, and his eyes were gentle. "Then I will marry you," he said simply, "if you still desire it." Prudence's throat tightened. She nodded. It was not a grand wedding planned over months, with invitations and silks and London chatter. It was something truer than that, a vow made in the open because hiding had become a kind of sin. Before the sun set, the church was lit from within, candles glowing in the windows like small, steady stars. The village gathered, not all, but enough. Some came out of curiosity, some came out of guilt. Some came because, deep down, they recognized courage when it stood in front of them and refused to bow. Prudence walked up the aisle with her cloak drawn close, her hands clasped tightly. She wore no jewels, no elaborate lace, only clean fabric, carefully mended, and a simple ribbon at her throat. Yet when Nathaniel turned to look at her, his face softened as if she wore a crown no gold could rival. Jonah was in his arms, calm and wide-eyed, as if even he sensed the holiness of the moment. When Prudence reached the front, Nathaniel took her hand with such tenderness it made her chest ache. His fingers were warm, steady, a silent promise. He looked at her as though the world behind her had vanished, as though all that existed was this woman who had saved his child, and without intending it, saved him. Reverend Pembroke spoke the words with quiet reverence. Prudence heard them as if from a distance, because Nathaniel's gaze held her in a language older than speech. When it came time for vows, Nathaniel did not speak like a nobleman reciting what was expected. He spoke like a man stripped down to truth. "I take you," he said, voice steady but thick with feeling. "Not because I must, but because my life has found its meaning in you. I will honor you. I will protect your dignity as fiercely as you protected my son. I will spend my days proving that love can be brave." Prudence's voice trembled, but she did not look away. "I take you," she said softly, "not for your title nor your estate, but for the man who came to my door with grief and left with hope. I will stand beside you when the world disapproves. I will love your child as my own, and I will never let you face darkness alone again." When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Nathaniel lifted Prudence's hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. slow, reverent, as if she were the only sacred thing left in the world. And then, finally, he leaned closer and kissed her temple, just above her cheekbone, where her tears had fallen earlier. It was not scandal. It was devotion made visible. Outside, the fog began to lift. The evening light broke through in pale gold, spilling over the lane, the churchyard, the fields beyond. Prudence stepped out with Nathaniel at her side, and Jonah held between them like a blessing the world could no longer deny. Some villagers watched in silence. A few bowed their heads. Mrs. Keene approached cautiously, clutching a small parcel. "For the baby," she murmured, voice trembling. "And for you, Prudence. I was wrong." Prudence swallowed, tears gathering again. She did not answer with pride. She answered with grace. "Thank you," she said softly. Nathaniel's hand found the small of her back, protective, gentle, unashamed. Prudence felt it like a vow renewed. As they walked the lane together, the brass lantern still burning in her cottage window behind them, Prudence looked up at Nathaniel. "Do you think," she whispered, "we have truly won?" Nathaniel turned his head, his eyes deep and steady. "We have chosen," he said, "and that is the only victory that matters." Jonah made a small sound of contentment, his fingers curling around Prudence's ribbon. She laughed through tears, and Nathaniel's gaze softened at the sound, as if her joy were the final proof that the world had not managed to ruin what was pure. They walked on, through mist turning to light, through a village learning to breathe again, through a future uncertain in its battles, but certain in its heart. Because love, once spoken aloud, cannot be locked back into silence. And the light they had kept burning, lantern to lantern, soul to soul, had finally become day. The year was 1830, and the Cotswolds had changed in ways both subtle and profound. New carriages rolled along the lanes that once saw only carts and hoofprints. The church had been rebuilt after a storm, its bell newly polished, and the Ashcroft estate, long closed to the world, now stood open, its windows aglow each evening, the laughter of children spilling through its halls like sunlight after years of rain. Beyond the village, past the fields that glimmered golden in late summer, a willow tree still bowed over the stream. It had grown taller, its roots deeper, and beneath its shade 2 figures often came to sit in the quiet hours before dusk, a man whose hair had begun to silver at the temples, and a woman whose beauty had ripened with grace rather than faded with time. Nathaniel and Prudence Ashcroft. The years had softened neither his devotion nor her courage. They had built a life upon the ashes of scandal, not through grand declarations, but through constancy. The world had tried to shame them into silence, but time, as it often does, had turned whispers into reverence. The villagers now spoke of them with a kind of pride, as if their love had been a victory for everyone who had ever been told they were unworthy of it. Their marriage had given them 2 more children. Eleanor, quick-minded and fearless, who had her mother's warmth and her father's stubbornness, and Samuel, a boy with eyes the color of storm clouds and a laugh that could break any sadness apart. But Jonah, now 11, remained the heartbeat of their home, the thread that tied their past to every blessing that followed. He rode horses with his father, read poetry to his mother by the fire, and still, when night fell, asked her to light the brass lantern that had once been a symbol of longing. And she did, every night. Even now, though Nathaniel slept beside her, and love no longer needed proof, Prudence kept that flame alive. Its light had become a ritual, a quiet promise that even the surest loves must be tended. Sometimes, when the children were asleep, she would find Nathaniel by the window, watching the flicker with a soft smile. "You still keep it burning," he would say, and she would answer as she always had, "Because I remember the darkness that came before." He would draw her close then, his arms strong but gentle, his breath warm against her hair. "You saved me from it," he would murmur, "every day since." It was not always easy. The world had not forgotten what had been defied. Invitations to London balls came slowly, and the aristocracy never quite forgave Nathaniel for marrying the village woman who had ruined propriety. Yet the irony was that those same people, when tragedy struck their own families, came to her quietly for help because Prudence's compassion had become her legend. She had founded a small school near the church, teaching children of farmers and merchants alike to read and write, and when widows or mothers fell ill, it was she who sat at their bedside. "She does the work of saints," Reverend Pembroke would often say, smiling, "and she does it without needing wings." Nathaniel's reforms on his estate followed her example. He abolished cruel tenant contracts, built cottages with proper hearths, and turned his fortune toward those who had once served his name. The land prospered, not because of fear or title, but because the man who ruled it had learned, through one woman's defiance, that power meant nothing without mercy. And what of those who had sought to destroy them? Lady Celeste's story was whispered still, though never aloud in the Ashcroft house. Stripped of influence after her deceit came to light, she fled to the north, where she lived in isolation among cousins who tolerated her only out of pity. The world she had tried to preserve, the brittle order of inheritance and pride, was already fading. By the time she died, her name was little more than an echo of a crueler age. When news of her passing reached the estate, Prudence felt no triumph, only a quiet sorrow. She lit the lantern that night and whispered a prayer, not for vengeance, but for peace. Nathaniel, seeing the light from the doorway, kissed her forehead. "You forgive even the unforgivable," he said softly. "I forgive because I know what bitterness costs," she replied, and he understood. Years turned like pages, gentle and unhurried. Their children grew with the rhythm of the seasons. Jonah began to study architecture, sketching the old church and dreaming of rebuilding it larger, brighter. Eleanor spoke often of travel, while Samuel loved the land too much to ever leave it. Prudence's hair, once the shade of chestnuts, was now threaded with silver. Nathaniel's eyes had deepened with the lines of a life well lived. They walked together through every storm and calm, and each evening they returned to the same place, the willow by the stream where it had all begun. There, beneath branches whispering in the wind, they would sit close, sometimes talking, sometimes silent, always touching hands. One summer twilight, Jonah, taller now than his mother, his voice deepening, found them there. "You always come here," he said, smiling. "Why this place?" Nathaniel looked at Prudence, his eyes tender. "Because it reminds us of the day we nearly lost everything," he said. Prudence squeezed his hand gently. "And of how we found it again." Jonah nodded, not fully understanding but knowing it mattered. He kissed his mother's cheek, bowed slightly to his father, old habits of respect dying slow, and walked back toward the house, where the lights in the windows had begun to glow. When he was gone, Nathaniel turned to Prudence. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if I had never come to your door that night?" She smiled faintly. "Sometimes. And then I realized that I would have still lit my lamp, even without knowing why." He laughed softly, shaking his head, "and I would have seen it wherever I was." The evening deepened around them, fireflies sparking between the reeds. Prudence leaned her head against his shoulder, listening to the steady beat of his heart. They had lived through scandal, through loneliness, through the cruel gaze of society, and still the rhythm of their love endured. 10 years, she murmured. "It feels both long and brief." "Because it has been full," he said simply. "Time cannot measure what is whole." A breeze stirred the willow branches, scattering the scent of water and wildflowers. Nathaniel lifted his head toward the fading sky. "The stars are coming early tonight." "Then we should go home," Prudence said, rising. "The children will worry." He stood with her, his hand sliding naturally into hers. As they walked back across the meadow, the last light of day touched their faces. In the distance, the brass lantern still shone in their window, its flame small but unwavering, the same one that had burned through every doubt, every storm, every separation. When they reached the house, the sound of laughter spilled into the night. Eleanor was chasing Samuel around the table, Jonah was setting out books, and the old dog, grey and content, slept by the fire. Prudence paused at the threshold, her heart swelling with quiet gratitude. Nathaniel stepped behind her, his arm encircling her waist. "This," he whispered, "is all I ever wanted." "And all I ever dared to hope for," she replied. He turned her gently to face him, their foreheads nearly touching. "Do you still believe in the lantern?" She smiled. "I believe in what it taught us, that love is not a light you find. It's one you keep burning, even when the world would rather it go dark." Nathaniel kissed her then, softly, reverently, as he had on the day they wed. The years fell away in that single moment. The fear, the loss, the battles. There was only warmth, only the miracle of two souls who had chosen each other once and never unchosen. Outside, the wind carried the sound of the church bell across the hills, a slow, solemn toll marking the hour. And in that brief harmony of love and time, of firelight and memory, the story of Nathaniel and Prudence came to rest, not as a tale of scandal or defiance, but as proof that love, when it is true, does not fade. It endures, it grows with the seasons, it forgives what the world cannot, and it shines quietly and faithfully long after the last lantern has gone out. Every love story leaves something behind, a whisper, a lesson, a flame that refuses to go out. Prudence and Nathaniel's journey reminds us that true love is not born from perfection, but from courage. It is the quiet defiance of two souls who choose each other again and again, even when the world tells them not to. Their lantern burned through judgment, loss, and fear, and in doing so it became more than light. It became faith. Faith that compassion can heal what pride destroys. Faith that forgiveness is stronger than vengeance. Faith that love, when it is real, endures, not because it is easy, but because it is brave. If this story touched your heart, tell us what part stayed with you the most in the comments. And to those who reach this very last moment, write the word lantern below. It's our secret way of knowing that you stayed with Prudence and Nathaniel until their final light. Every comment, every word you share helps keep these stories alive for more hearts to find them. If you wish to support the small team behind these historical romances, you can send a super thanks on YouTube with any amount you wish. It means the world to us and helps us keep creating new tales of love, courage, and redemption. And if you cannot give in that way, sharing this story with someone who loves period romances is another beautiful gift. It helps our little community grow and brings more dreamers to our village of stories. Thank you for watching, for feeling, and for believing in love that stands the test of time. Don't forget to explore the other romantic tales waiting for you in the cards above, each one carrying its own light, waiting to be discovered. Because some lights never fade, they just pass from one heart to another.